Hello, and welcome to the Absolute Beginner Guitar Lesson Series. My name is Oliver, and today's lesson is lesson number 8. And before we get into the lesson, as I always do at the beginning of these lessons, I would like to invite anyone who may be watching one of these lessons for the first time to go back and watch the previous lesson. Today's lesson is on sharps and flats. Let's get into it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make a couple statements, and I'd like you to write these statements down. And the first one is, to sharp a note, raise the note by 1/2 step. To sharp a note, raise the note by 1/2 step. And this is something that I need you to try to sort of commit to memory, because it's going to be important moving forward in the lesson. And the next statement is, to flat a note, lower the note by 1/2 step. So hopefully you've written this stuff down. I'm going to erase it from the board, just because I'm going to need some space and I really don't want to overcrowd the board with information. So the next thing I'm going to need you to do is I'm going to need you to, get your guitar. And what I'm going to ask you to do first is I'm going to ask you to play the note C at the first fret on the B string. So we're at the first fret of the B string. Now I want you to play the note D along the same string. And I hope that you know by now how to find that note. But if you don't, I want you to play the note at the 3rd fret on the B string. That's the D note. So now I want you to play that D on the 3rd fret again. And now I'd like you to play the note E on the same string. And hopefully you know that the note E can be found at the 5th fret on the B string. So let's go back to when you played the C at the 1st fret of the B string, and then you played the D at the 3rd fret of the B string. It should be apparent to you that there's a note in between the C and the D at the 2nd fret. And now let me draw your attention to when you played the note D at the 3rd fret on the B string, and then I had you play the note E at the 5th fret on the B string. And I'm sure your eyes told you that there was a note in the middle of those two notes at the 4th fret. So what are these notes? Well, the answer to that question is these notes are sharps and flats. I also want to sort of now direct your attention to the whiteboard. And you see I have a scale written out here. Hopefully by now you recognize that this is a C major scale. So I have the notes of the C major scale, and then I have the interval sequence. When you played the note at the 1st fret, a C, and then I asked you to play D, hopefully your knowledge of music theory told you that the note D was a whole step above the C, and therefore it was 2 frets higher on the same string. So there was a whole step difference between those two notes, the C and the D. And there was also a whole step difference between the note D at the 3rd fret and the note E at the 5th fret. Well, everywhere you find whole steps, in this scale, is, for example, C to D, D to E, F to G, G to A, and A to B. Everywhere we find those whole steps, there's a note that lies in the middle. So there'll be a note that lies in the middle between C and D, a note that lies between D and E, and so on. Everywhere we see these whole step intervals. And these are the notes that we're going to be talking about in this lesson. So now I want to go back to the guitar. And I want you to go ahead and play that C note at the first fret of the B string. So let me ask you, if I asked you to raise that note by a half step, what would you do? Hopefully your knowledge of music theory tells you that to raise a note up by a half step on a guitar, we have to go one fret higher. So you would go to the second fret to find that note. So now let me direct your attention to the note D at the third fret of the B string. Go ahead and play that note. And now I want you to lower that note by one half step. Hopefully you know by now that if we want to, if we're at a note and we want to go down a half step, we need to move down one fret. So hopefully you would move from the D note at the third fret to the second fret. So what is that note at the second fret? Well, the answer to that question is it depends on how the note is referenced. And now let's go back to the whiteboard. I'm going to just write in the note C here, and then I'm going to write in the note D. And I'm basically going to draw a line in between those notes underneath, indicating that the interval between the C and the D note is a whole step. So we have the C, which is at the first fret of the B string. We have the D, which is at the third fret. And we know there's a whole step between them. Well, what we're interested in is the note that lies exactly in the middle between those two notes. And also, it's important to understand that this note here in the middle is a half step higher than the C note. And it's also a half step lower than the D note. So let me just refer back to the last couple things I had you do on the guitar. When you were at the C note on the first fret, I asked you to raise that up by a half step. And hopefully you moved up from the first fret to the second fret. Well, as I mentioned in the statements that I opened with, if you raise a note by a half step, you sharp the note. So now, if we take that C at the first fret and we raise it up by a half step, the note becomes C sharp. So hopefully you can follow that. And now let me refer back to when I had you play the D at the third fret of the B string. And then I asked you to lower that note by a half step, and you moved it to the second fret, hopefully. Well, when we lower a note by a half step, we flat the note. So the D note at the third fret becomes D flat at the second fret. So I hope you understand. I hope you understand that. We have a C, we raise it up by a half step, it becomes C sharp. If we have a D, we lower it by a half step, it becomes D flat. So what we can see here is we actually have two names for this note, C sharp and D flat. And in all honesty, if you were to call the note C sharp, you wouldn't be wrong. Or if you were to call it D flat, you wouldn't be wrong. However, when we're talking about things from a theoretical perspective, it depends on how the note is referenced. We took the C note at the first fret and we raised that up by a half step. So therefore, the C becomes C sharp. And we took the D note at the third fret and we lowered it by a half step. So the D becomes D flat. So this is kind of something that I really need you to get your head around. And I hope that my explanation works for you and you're sort of understanding what we're getting at. But we're going to get into this a little bit more. And we're going to start looking at major scales that contain these sharp and flat notes. So just a little bit to review. So far we've been working with the C major scale. And the reason we've been doing it is because it's easy to work with. As we can see, there are no sharps and flats. However, C major is the only major scale that does not contain sharps or flats. So if we are going to be working with other major scales, we're going to have to contend with sharps and flats. And what we're going to start doing right now is we're going to start deriving some scales. And as we derive these, we will have to use sharps or flats in the scale. And actually, in lesson number 1 on the musical alphabet, I talked about how the letters of the musical alphabet, along with modifiers, can be used to name any note in the Western system of music. And these sharps and flats are the modifiers. And I like to look at it from a perspective of the sharps and flats modify the letters that we have written in for the scale. So I hope that's important, or I think that's important for you to remember, and I hope you will remember it. But before we really start with these scales, there's a couple sort of ground rules I want to throw out here, because there's a method that I want us to use in order to come up with these. And if we follow these rules, then I think we can be successful. So the first thing we need to do is we need to understand that this interval sequence represents the formula for a major scale. So any major scale has to adhere to that interval sequence, or else it's not a major scale. The interval sequence is what makes the scale major and gives it the major scale sound. So rule number 1, all our scales, all our notes must fit in to this interval sequence. And I also want to just make an observation here that if we look at the C major scale, every letter of the musical alphabet is used. We simply started on D and we worked our way through the musical alphabet until we came to C again, an octave higher. So these are our rules. We're going to need to follow this interval sequence, and we're going to need to use every letter of the musical alphabet. So now I think we're ready to get into some scales. So the first scale, major scales, let me just be specific. The first major scale we're going to be looking at is the G major scale. So again, this methodology that I have requires that we use every letter of the alphabet. So we can just start with our root note here, G. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the letters of the alphabet. This is not a C major scale that we are constructing. So therefore, we're going to need some sharps or flats. And also, I want to really quickly, before I forget to tell you this, I'm going to say this about major scales. Some major scales contain sharps. Some major scales contain flats. But we will not find sharps and flats together in the same major scale. So now we have our alphabet, our note sequence here, our letter sequence, if you will. But technically it's not correct. What we need to do is we need to follow through the interval sequence to see whether or not we need to modify any of these notes. So, and I think you'll come to understand it as we move along. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the root note, and then we're just going to follow the interval sequence to make sure we have the right note. So we have a root note, we're at G, and we need to go up one whole step from G. So with our knowledge of music theory, we know that from G to A is a whole step. So this A note is good. So we're at the A, and now we need to go up a whole step. Well, hopefully you know by now that from A to B is a whole step. So that works there. The B is correct. So from here, we need to go up a half step. Well, we're at B, and if we go up a half step, we're going to get to C. So far, all these notes correctly fit this interval sequence. But let's continue. We're at C, and now we need to go up a whole step. Well, from C to D is a whole step. So we're good here. We're at D, we need to go up a whole step. From D to E is a whole step. So our E note is good. So we're at the E note, and we need to go up a whole step. Well, hopefully you realize that from E to F is only a half step. And we actually need to go further beyond F, but not as far as G. So we've gone a half step from E to F, but we still need to go another half step. However, we need to use the letter F in our scale because every letter of the alphabet needs to fit into the scale. So what we need is we need a note that's halfway between F and G. Oops. So I get C on the brain sometimes. F and G. So we went a half step to get from E to F, but we need to go another half step. However, we have to relate this note to the F. So what we need to do is we need to take this F and we need to raise it by a half step. And when we raise that note by a half step, our note becomes F sharp. So hopefully you followed that. So now we are at, oops, let me write in my sharp note here. So now we have our first sharp note, the F sharp. However, we still have to finish our scale. So we're at the F sharp, which is halfway between F and G. And we need to go a half step. Well, as we can see here, the F sharp note is a half step lower than the G. So if we take our F sharp note and we go up a half step, we will get G. So now we have our G major scale. And I want us to make observations about these scales. And all major scales have their sort of unique quality among the other major scales. And when we worked with the C major scale, its unique quality was that it is the only major scale that contains no sharps or flats. Well, if we look at our G major scale, we can see that the G major scale contains one sharp note, and that note is F sharp. So we could say that the unique quality that the G major scale has is that it contains one sharp note. For our G major scale, we have F sharp. So that's our first scale. It's the G major scale. And I just want to keep moving on here because I know these lessons can run really long. All right, so the next scale we're going to look at is D major. So I'm just going to, in keeping with this method that we're using, I'm just going to start with our D root note. And then I'm going to go ahead and fill in the rest of the notes of the musical alphabet. So what we need to do now is we need to start with our root note and we need to follow our interval sequence to see which notes need to be modified. So we start with a D, and as you can see, we need to go up a whole step. And from D to E is a whole step. So the E is the correct note. We're at E, we need to go up a whole step. Well, this sort of harkens back to our last scale, the G major scale, where we had this very same scenario. We were at E and we needed to go up a whole step. We know that from E to F is only a half step. So now we are at F and we need to go up a half step. But we also need to make sure that we reference our note to F. So what we need to do is we need to raise this F up by a half step, and that will bring us to F sharp. So we are now at F sharp, halfway between F and G, and we need to go up a half step. Well, as we can see from our diagram, if we are at F sharp and we go up a half step, we get to G. So G is the correct note. From here, we need to go up a whole step. And from G to A is a whole step. So the A is the correct note. From here, we need to go up a whole step. From A to B is a whole step. So that's the correct note. So we're at B and we need to go up a whole step. Well, hopefully by now you know that from B to C is only a half step, and we need to go up a whole step. So essentially what we have is we have the same situation. We've gone up a half step, which puts us at C. Now we have D a whole step above that. Well, we've gone a half step, so we only need to go another half step. So we need to note that's a half step higher than C. And we have to reference this note to C. So in order to do that, we need to take this C and raise it up by a half step. And that will give us the note we need, C sharp. So now we're at C sharp and we need to go a half step. Now I'm going to work this out, but I'll point something out that I'm sure you obviously could see. We're halfway between the C and the D, and we need to go a half step. So hopefully from seeing these examples, you recognize now that if we take C and we go C sharp and we go up a half step, we get D. So there's our last note. So now we have the D major scale. And if we make some observations, we can see that the D major scale contains two sharp notes. So I'm going to write over here D major scale, and it contains F sharp, which was also in the G major scale. And now we have the addition of the C major scale, or excuse me, the C sharp note. So now we have our D major scale, and it is the only major scale that contains two sharp notes. So we've seen a major scale that has no sharps. We've seen a major scale that has one sharp. We've seen a major scale that has two sharps. I can tell you right now, there is a major scale that has three sharps in it. And I can also tell you that two of the sharp notes will be F and C. So next, I want to look at the A major scale. So that's our A major scale. And the A major scale, as I hinted at, has 3 sharps in it. And we have the F and the C that were contained in the D major scale. And now we have the addition of a 3rd sharp note. And the unique quality among major scales that the A major scale has is it is the only major scale that contains 3 sharp notes. So there is a major scale that contains 4 sharp notes, but I don't really think we need to go any further. I just wanted to sort of illustrate how the sharp notes end up being used in certain scales. So we've looked at the sharp side of things. Now I want to look at some scales that have flat notes in them. So now I want to look at the F major scale. Now we just need to apply our interval sequence to see which notes we need to modify. So we're starting out with the root note. We're at F. We need to go up a whole step. Well, from F to G is a whole step. So G is the correct note. So now we're at G and we need to go up a whole step. From G to A is a whole step. A is the correct note. Now we're at A and we need to go a half step. Well, hopefully you know by now that from A to B is a whole step. And we only need to go a half step. So we need to go and find that note that's in between A and B. However, we must reference this note to the B. And in order to do that, we must take the B and lower it by a half step. And when we lower it by a half step, it becomes B flat. Now, I hope that wasn't confusing because we were in the middle of 2 notes here. And yes, we're not going as far as B, but we need to reference our note to B. So we need to take this B note and we need to modify it so it works. And the only way we can do that is to take the B and lower it by a half step. And that's what gives us the B flat. So now, continuing on, we're at B flat. We need to go a whole step. Well, we can see that we are halfway between A and B. If we take the B flat and we go up a half step, we'll get to A. However, we need to go a whole step. So we're at B and we need to go another half step. And if we take B and we go up a half step, we get the note C. So that's our note here. So we're at C. We need to go up a whole step. That gives us D. And from D, we need to go up a whole step. That gives us E. And finally, from E, we need to go up a half step, and that gives us F. So now we have a major scale containing a flat note. And it's important to understand why we need to call that note B flat and why we're not calling it A sharp. It's because we need to reference the note to B. So now I'm going to put over here in my notes, the F major scale contains 1 flat note, and that is its unique quality amongst the major scales. It is the only major scale that has 1 flat note in it, and that flat note is B, B flat. Okay, so let's keep moving on. The next scale we're going to look at is the B flat major scale. So now we're getting into something a little bit different here. We're starting with a root note that is a flat note. However, there's no need to get freaked out about it. we can proceed in the same way we have for all the other scales. So now let's apply our interval sequence and see what notes we'll need to modify. So we're starting with the B flat. So when we start or we're moving from a flat note, it's important for us to be able to sort of get our head around the fact that the B flat note is in between A and B, and it's a half step below the B. So we need to go up a whole step. Well, if we go up a half step from the B, or from the B flat, we'll get to the note B. But we need to go one half step more. So if we're at B and we go up a half step, we have C. So C is the correct note. So we're at C, we need to go up a whole step, and that will give us D. And from D, we need to go up a half step. Well, our knowledge of music theory tells us that from D to E is a whole step. So this is going to be, the E is going to be modified. So we're at D, we need to go up a half step. So we need to find the note in the middle between D and E. However, we must reference our note to the E. So in order to do that, we must take the E and lower it by a half step and make the note E flat. We're at E flat and we need to go up a whole step. So we're halfway in between D and E at E flat. If we go up a half step, that will bring us to E. But we still need to go one half step further. If we go up a half step from E, we get F. So we're at F, we need to go up a whole step. From F to G is a whole step. So G is correct note. From G, we need to go up a whole step. From G to A is a whole step, so that's correct. We need to go up a half step, and that will bring us to the B flat note. So now we have our B flat major scale. And we can see that the B flat major scale contains two flat notes. So our scale is B flat. And however, one of those flat notes is the B flat note that we found in the F major scale. So we have the B flat note, and we also have the addition of the E flat note. So now what we've seen is we have a major scale that has one flat note in it, and the scale is F major. And we have a major scale with two flat notes in it, and that scale is B flat major. So now it sort of follows that we're going to have a major scale with three flats in it. So our E flat major scale contains B flat, E flat, and A flat. So we could continue. There is a major scale that contains four flats in it. However, we don't need to do every scale. Hopefully by now you're starting to sort of get the point of why we use these modifiers, these sharps and flats for certain scales. And that some major scales have sharps in them, and that some major scales have flats in them. So that's essentially the basic fundamental information of the lesson. Hopefully I did a good job explaining to you from a theoretical perspective how sharps and flat notes come about. And we worked through some scales, and we saw why there was a need for sharp notes in some of these major scales, and why there was a need for flat notes in some of these major scales. And what I want you to do is essentially the same thing that we've just done here. I want you to work your way through some scales. And actually, I want you to derive the scales in the same manner that we did. Hopefully, nobody needs this information down here. I'm going to erase that. So the thing to remember is that we will always, our major scale will always fit, the notes of our major scale will always fit this interval sequence. And that we need to start with every letter of the musical alphabet, starting on the root note and going through to the octave to the root note. What I want to do here is I want to have you work out some of these scales, because it's very good work, very good homework, and it will actually help you to learn these scales. So what I'm going to do is down here, I'm going to write sharp. And I'm just going to put a little line here, and I'm going to write flat. So I'm just dividing the major scales up between the scales that have sharps in them and the scales that have flats in them. So these are the scales that I want you to write out, derive, and work with. So on this side that has, for the major scales that contain the sharps, I want you to work with G major, D major, A major, and E major. And just as a little piece of information, the G major scale has 1 sharp in it. The D major scale has 2 sharps in it. The A major scale has 3 sharps in it. And the E major scale has 4 sharps in it. And then on the flat side, these are scales that have flats in them. I want you to start with F, and then B flat, E flat, and A flat. So, and I'll just give you a little hint on this too. The F major scale contains 1 flat note. The B flat major scale contains 2. The E flat major scale contains 3. And the A flat major scale contains 4. Now these are 8 of the 12 major scales. So there's plenty of stuff for you to work on. And I would love to see you work on this stuff. And it doesn't take long, for a few minutes every day for at least a few days. And if you do this, you'll start to get your head around it. And the truth of the matter is, the more you do this, the more you write out a scale, the more it becomes familiar with you. And if you write out the G major scale, working through the method that we have here, if you do that enough times, you're going to memorize that scale. And the same thing will happen for any one of these scales. And if you're willing to put a little bit of work in and challenge yourself, you would be surprised at how knowledgeable you can become about these scales. And you will get to the point where you will be able to actually recite the scales because you'll know the scales. So the thing that I want you to do is working out these scales and coming up with the notes of the scales are just the beginning. What I want you to do is, once you work out a scale, I want you to do the same things with it that we did with the C major scale. I want you to, once you have your notes figured out, go ahead, write in the numbers of your scale, just like we did in lesson 3. And then go ahead and derive your scale tone chords using the method that we learned in lesson 3. And just like what happened with the C major scale, the same thing will happen with the D major scale. The notes of the chords will become available to you, and you'll also learn to know which chords are major and which chords are minor in a particular key. So that's the ultimate goal. It's not just to discuss sharps and flats for academic purposes, but to give you something that you can work with and you can internalize it. And once it becomes knowledge, then we go to the guitar and we start working to turn that knowledge into working knowledge. So I guess that's it. Put in your time, put in your work, and hope to see you at the next lesson. Peace.